Good morning. Welcome to Gallery Bytes. I'm Rachel Gottlieb, the Ruth Rippon Curator of Ceramics, and I'm here this morning with Mallory Marsh, Associate Director of Education at the Crocker Art Museum, Houghton Kinsman, the Adult Education Coordinator, and Brian Sir, who's from Marketing and heads up our graphic design and digital media at the Crocker Art Museum. So I'm very pleased to be here and welcome all you Crocker enthusiasts. Today I'm going to talk about one of my favorite objects, which is the Marilyn Levine briefcase. So a little bit of housekeeping before I start unpacking this object. If you have any questions about the work, please put it in the chat and Mallory Marsh will flag me and I will try to address and answer your question. And so then we can have more of a conversation, which would be delightful in this virtual setup. So Marilyn Levine's briefcase, why does it fascinate me and why should it fascinate so many of our visitors? And indeed, I think it does. Well, of course, in part it's its materiality and in part it's what it is and what it represents. And I'd like to try to answer this question of why this is such an interesting, intriguing object by one, looking at and considering Marilyn Levine's biography, who she was and how she came to her art form. And secondly, why the briefcase? Why is that such an important object for her? And why, and how does she do it? What's her process, really? So those are the themes I want to talk about, her biography, how it's made, and the subject matter. So, first of all, I should say that this briefcase was made in 1971, and you should know that while it looks like it's leather, it is actually made of stoneware. It's clay that she has mixed with nylon Dacron for its strength. And everything is handmade in the object. Everything. Took her a long time to make it. Takes her weeks, if not months, to make a single object. Also, I mean, if you can see the details of the stitching, of the buckles, that again is all clay. There's no mixed media here. The only thing she's doing is she's introducing nylon to make that leather hard clay. When the clay is leather hard, she can manipulate it, and that's what's so fantastic. So, a little bit about Marilyn Levine. Marilyn Levine is actually from the prairies in Canada. So she was born in Canada, and she did her education, completed her education in Canada before she discovered West Coast clay. And Marilyn Levine studied at university to become a chemist, in point of fact. And I think chemistry has really influenced her process and her discovery of how you can manipulate clay and mix it with another material to make it much stronger. So Marilyn Levine studied to be a chemist, as I said, in organic chemistry at the University of Alberta, so in the prairies. She marries and she moves to Regina in Saskatchewan, another Canadian province in the Midwest. Unfortunately, her husband is able to teach, but in the rules back then, this is like the 1960s, she is not allowed to teach because her husband is working. So what does she do? She turns to art classes. She's able to attend art classes. And lucky for us, it's there that she discovers the world of clay. But in this introduction to clay, she's really just making, teacups and vessels. But her eyes are opened. She decides that she wants to go to the West Coast, which is very exciting. She gets a Canada Council grant, which is very prestigious. So that means that she can write to people like Peter Volkos, James Melchert, William de Stabler, and say, hey, I'm a nobody from no place, but I have a Canada Council grant and I'd like to see your studio. And that's exactly what she does. She does it for a couple of months. And there's also a very interesting connection here. Like there's always a tension geographically, both in the United States and Canada, between the East and West. She doesn't go to the East. She goes west, it's closer to her. So she spends a few months and she meets Bob Arneson. She discovers this wonderful world of clay. She goes back to the prairies in Canada. She applies to over 80 schools to do graduate work, is turned down at every single MFA program that she applied to. So this is a real test of her resilience. James Melchert, who is teaching with Volkos at the University of California in Berkeley, comes to do a workshop in Regina, where she still is. And this workshop is pivotal for her in many ways. He assigns all the students in the room to make a pair of shoes in 20 minutes. And Marilyn Levine becomes so involved in this process that she's only able to make one shoe. But she blows, James Melchert's mind out of he thinks that's fantastic. And he says, wow, you should come to Berkeley and study with us. And she says, well, in point of fact, I applied and I was turned down. And then he says, okay, don't worry, no worries. I am going to give you a reference. So long story short, she comes to California. She studies formally under Volkos. But she's actually more influenced by the Bob Arneson group, that sort of the pop movement and the figure and what is known as funk. And while she's doing her MFA, this is where she focuses on the object, whether it's shoes, briefcases, leather jackets. And her chemistry background is extremely important because while she had been working a little bit with fiberglass to sort of create a composite clay, she writes to DuPont, the chemical industry, and then she manufactures, and she says, can you help me here? And they give her different samples, and it's she that really pioneers this technique and introduces nylon Dacron into the material. So essentially what she does is she sort of layers her clay, she throws them, everything is hand built, hand done, and she creates almost like a layering of these slabs, and then that allows her to get this tremendous strength in her material. She completes her MFA, she goes on, returns to Canada. Canada doesn't get her work, so Canada's loss, of course, is the United States' gain. She teaches for a while, and then eventually what happens is that she stops teaching and works full-time as a ceramic artist, or as an artist really, who works in clay. And she shares a studio with Peter Volkos, who opens up a famous warehouse for artists to work in an old macaroni factory in Oakland. And that's where she works and makes these incredible objects. So her biography then is important because she was a chemist. But let's now, and because she was able to study clay, I also want to mention that she was a woman artist working in a man's world, so that was also a real achievement for her. I think what's interesting is that she really never got bogged down in this hierarchy between craft and art. And in fact, her work was accepted as in the fine art world more than most clay artists, because she was part of this sort of hyperrealism, which was happening in both painting and photography, and she just happened to be working in the medium of clay. So she was very successful and one of the few ceramic artists at that time that was sort of elevated into that fine art world. But she really wasn't bogged down by labels, and she really has a sort of very interesting philosophical approach about her work. She's no longer alive. Unfortunately, she died in 2005 prematurely from cancer. But you can hear her voice if you want, and the link I think will be posted on this session. She gave a very long interview with the historian Glenn Adamson, and talks about her, her growing up in the prairies, and about her process and her artwork. And you really get a sense, while you only hear her voice, you really get a sense of her sort of no-nonsense approach. So, but she's a person, she's an artist that really specifically only worked in clay, and she only worked in stoneware, and she was always interested in only working in clay to make it look like leather. She was a true experimenter. She was a true experimenter, and that she never she was always testing her medium. So I believe we have a question.
We do, and it relates to the material, I think. So Joanna's asking, what happens to the fabric when the clay is fired, or does it dry naturally rather than get
It dries naturally, and when the object is fired, it doesn't crack. So sometimes when you introduce other materials, it cracks. But here, it's seamless, and it totally integrates into the material and allows for this amazing design. So back to the object itself, the briefcase. Why shoes? Why briefcase? Why a leather jacket, which, as I said, takes weeks or months to make. And for her, and this is where we see this tension between the object and the absent subject matter. For her, the leather, and why leather? And for her, leather can embody the traces of the human touch and who we were. So, and these are objects that were made to be used by someone, and we don't know who that someone is. And leather wears beautifully, right? It gets that patina. So what Marilyn Levine says is, I'm trying to sort of capture who this person is through the traces of the object that remains. So there's something very poetic and poignant about these objects. They're kind of sad because they were once used, but who used them? So I think that they're just this treatise of the traces of absence of a person who is no longer there. So that is really an important theme for Marilyn Levine, although she's not an overly theoretical artist by any means. The other interest, she really is fascinated by trying to trick the eye, and there is clay trickery here. Clay is often very, very tactile and spontaneous, and you just want to touch it. And here, she's really playing with optical illusion. It's the opticality of the object that she's emphasizing, rather than the tangibility or the desire to touch it, to touch the clay. However, that's a bit of a contradiction, isn't it? Because you want to touch it. You want to say, hey, is that a metal clasp? There must be metal in there. Hey, is that leather stitching? Or is that clay? So she's really kind of synthesizing both the optical and the tangible. She's synthesizing these senses into one particular object. That's what she's doing here. I mean, and I think, and confusion is really what she wants the visitor to experience, right? And that is exactly what trompe-l'oeil is about. And I think that she's extremely successful and masterful at exercising this amazing feat in clay. And I think she sort of is able to capture something else that is really important. Of course, as I said, she's working obviously out of the art movement of pop and funk, but there's no humor here. This is a serious work. But she's definitely would acknowledge that that's where she came from. She's also interested in this hyperrealism, photorealism, prioritizing of objects. But today, where she's no longer alive, there is a lot of interest by all sorts of philosophers and theorists about the agency of objects. And here I think she is really giving objects a meaning that in that they exist on their own, but they don't. They also are very much tied to the subject matter. So it's, again, another way to confuse you. Is it clay or is it leather? Is it about the suitcase or is it about the missing person? So I think that's what's really quite interesting. And so, and then, you know, and this is where she's able to say a simple briefcase or a leather jacket or a pair of shoes have this tremendous amount of agency because it's so related to the missing subject. So Mallory, I believe we have another question.
Yeah, are her objects in leather, are they always distressed and worn, or did she do any that were like new leather?
No, it's always, that's a very good question. Worn is very important because worn shows the traces of human existence. And that is really what is her treatise here with these objects.
So no optimistic potential. It's all
no real. It's the opposite of funk, really, right? She said she made some funk pieces where and with funk it's usually it's much more fast and furious and glossy glazes and jokey. You know, there's a pun often related to the title. And no, I think she has she goes into a different direction. And that she really is a very serious, committed artist, and she's an experimenter. And I think that's very reflected in her work and in this wonderful audio recording that the Smithsonian organized.
Building on that idea of experimentation, did she experiment with the glazing or the finishing?
Well, no, I mean, she was very meticulous. She says she never used molds. She would rather just spend hours and hours and hours working on a particular buckle. Let's say, she said, of course, it would make sense to make a mold. And I think, no, I mean, she's always wants this patina and what she said of leather, so she doesn't want to stray from that. Now clay is very interesting because many artists, ceramic artists, love the spontaneity of clay, just when the malleable clay when it's wet, and also the glazing can be very spontaneous, particularly when it's fired. So you don't necessarily know what the result is until it comes through the clay. For Levine, she says, I don't want anything spontaneous from the process. I control it entirely. I might change, the content of Dacron versus, clay, but nothing is here by accident. Everything is something that she controls. She is a perfectionist. And in point of fact, she really did, in her studio, she said at times she would have assistants to help her make work, but she said she didn't like it. She just wants to control it all herself. So I hope that answers the question. We're good for questions? Okay. So I think, she's an amazing artist, and I think it's important to understand that she's not just fooling the eye. She's offering us something much deeper and more profound in her collection of leather objects, and to really appreciate that it took her months and months to make. This whole display case, which I'll wrap up now, shows other artists working in that same conceit of trompe-l'oeil, or tricking the eye. So we see the Singer oil can by Karen Shapiro, and again, like Marilyn Levine, she aggrandized the object. She supersized it. Karen Shapiro was formerly a pastry chef, so again, probably had a very scientific approach to her work. She's based in Montalcino. And I think what's interesting here is, we have a sense of nostalgia for the oil can for a Singer sewing machine. So it shows old graphic design, so that it's no longer in production. But she will say, Karen Shapiro says, my work is really just more about fun and about triggering memory. And I think, so there's a sense of nostalgia, but I'm not so sure about this dichotomy between the user and the object itself, because you don't sort of see, you know that with the leather briefcase, for example, it's worn because a person used it. What's also interesting about Karen Shapiro is her technique is a little different than Marilyn Levine in that in her third firing, she's working with raku. And the raku is basically it's submerging the this object with tongs into a container that has these flaming hot. It's flaming hot with a tremendous amount of smoke, and it's known as raku firing, and it allows, as you can see here, the crackles, the cracks of the in the white in the clay, and in fact the crackling happens all over the surface. It's also fantastic for metallic sheens, which we see on the top and on the and at the base. So that is Karen Shapiro, and she is working in the sort of same conceit of clay trickery and trompe-l'oeil, but with a different approach than Marilyn Levine's. And finally, we have the work here of Vernon Patrick, which is called cleverly Middle America Post and Lintel. So like Shapiro, he looks at the nostalgia of old graphic design. And like both artists, he's working with clay, in this case with stoneware, and he's creating sort of an architectural conceit of two posts supporting the lintel, which is a paper bag. So these are all, Vernon Patrick was a long-term professor at California State at Chico, and also he is working with funk. I think there's more humor here of the three works here on display. So I think that's all from me, and all I can say is please come to the Crocker Art Museum. We're open Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, and you must see this case yourself and enjoy clay as in the medium of trompe-l'oeil. Thank you.